Well, good morning, or afternoon, as the case may be, when you're watching this. My name is Jack. I'm 71 years old, and I am really pleased to be able to participate in this project. Wanted to identify for you very broadly in my life, there have been three major points of influence. My mother was my major influence relative to my personality. My father, both my mother and father, grew up during the Depression and much different types of experiences. Uh, my father wasn't around a lot because he was constantly working. My father was a glass blower. He would able to make neon signs, but he could also make swans and ornate vases and things of that nature. But he wasn't around, as I mentioned, because he was constantly working, and that's based on his experience back in the Depression. I was never, up even to this point, have never been as good with handling money as my father was. Uh, all his work, his philosophy was he would buy his first house out of the military after World War II. It was on the GI Bill, and then every other house he bought, he paid cash for. I'm not that good with money, but my mother was the major influence. She was the one that helped me with my penmanship and spelling in class and so on. And I think that most of my personality, the way I relate to people and so on, is a product of my mother's influence because she was at home, not as it is today where the husband and wife, both are working, but she was at home all the time with my brother and I. And so that was a major influence. The second, and you may or may not be able to tell that from the presentation, is I'm a fat guy. And the influence that had, my mother tells me that both my brother and my brother is bigger than I am, that we both had long, curly, blonde hair when we were youngsters. And at least for me, that lasted, and I was a normal size, up till about seventh grade. At that point, though, I apparently got fat, and I have been fat since that time. And the influence that's had is the issue around confidence, stepping outside of your comfort zone to do things. I may have liked to go to dances or to play certain sports, things of that nature. And because of my vision of what my size was, I was reluctant to do that. Now, I got out of that vision, but it probably took me 30, 35 years to come to the conclusion that I'm a fat guy, and if you don't like it, that's just too bad. And realistically, I started going into theater. I did a lot of community theater and have been involved in some interesting shows. I've been hit with a chicken. I've had to get in front of an audience and cheer like a cheerleader. I've looked like an old-time comic, Dom DeLuise. Okay, I was dressed in a tunic and all of that type of stuff. I was a Russian spy in a play. So I've done a lot of different things, but not as me. I've done it as those characters. So I just made peace with the idea after doing a lot of dieting and up and down and over and around that this is how I am and I'm going to proceed. So that just took a long time, and that had a great influence on how I related to people. The last influence, major influence now, and this has been over the last 3 or 4 years, is my wife, and we'll be married 44 years next month. it's April of this year. She has Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed about almost 4 years ago, and they figure that she's probably got another 4 or 5 years until she passes. So that's changed my vision about working, about what I want to do outside the house, because I feel that I have an obligation when you stand in front of the priest, because we are Catholic, and you tell them, and by the way, the priest who married my wife and I, Jackie and I, he was my uncle. And you say, you commit to do things for better or worse, in sickness and in health. You can think about it and say, hey, times are bad, it's time to go. No, at least not for me. You've committed, you've given your word, and you do what you have to do. You have to be true to yourself. I'm a firm believer that you look at yourself in the mirror, and if you don't like what you see, then you need to change. So those are the three major influences, if you will, that have gotten me here. And that is, I'm a first-person Civil War reenactor. And I got into that by accident. I saw an advertisement in the Wilmington paper back, I believe it was 2000 or 2001, at Fort Delaware State Park. They were looking to reconstruct All's Independent Battery, which was the first Delaware Heavy Artillery Unit, which is a unit that was out there at Fort Delaware during the Civil War, starting in July of 1863, and it was comprised, aside from the officers, of Confederates who had changed sides. So I go out and get involved with that. That led to doing plays. Because we are first-person reenactors, we portray people who actually were at Fort Delaware during the American Civil War. My character came from North Carolina, from Wilkes County, North Carolina. He was in Company K, 53rd North Carolina. I have been to his gravesite. And when I portray that fellow, and he was 22 years old when he enlisted in 1862. I'm no longer 22. I'm not some thin fellow, because I have a picture of him when he was about 75 or so. But that's not important. I try to overcome that by the interpretation. So the three things, again, that really had influenced me was my mother, and she was significant in my personality development. My weight, okay, still an issue now. Hey, as a little aside, I was sick about 4 years ago, 2013, and I lost 50 pounds. And after that problem was resolved, I went out and bought all new clothes, because, I'm 50 pounds lighter. Well, that didn't last very long, because now I'm back to where I was before, and I've concluded that that's where I'm supposed to be. So, the idea of trying to be something I'm not, worrying about things that I'm no longer concerned about, being a model. I'm myself. I've concluded that that's how it's going to be. So I guess what I'm trying to say is don't be afraid to acknowledge issues around yourself, right? Also, don't be afraid to step outside of your comfort zone. Okay, the first play locally in Wilmington that I did was a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, and I'm a sailor, and I'm dressed. I actually went out and bought women's tights, and I've got a tunic on, and this was down at the Wilmington Drama League, and because most Romans didn't wear glasses, and I'm blind without my glasses, they actually put reflective tape at the edge of the stage down there where the orchestra was, just in case I got close so I wouldn't fall in. I never wanted to be, if you will, the star. I was really comfortable being in the chorus, and I could dance a little bit, and I could sing, and when it got to the high notes, and then when it came back to my vocal range, I would come back in again, which I couldn't do if I was one of the main players. And so that was fine for me, but I got to learn a great deal. You got to learn your presence on stage, how to do things, how to ad lib, because if any of you have ever done theater, you know anything's possible on stage. I mean, I've been on stage when the lights have gone out, people have missed lines. In one case, helping out with Damn Yankees, the scenery collapsed. So you got to be prepared. But stepping outside of your comfort zone may open up a lot of avenues to you that if you're always concerned about, gee, the way I look or the way I sound or my weight, this and that, you may miss out on some really nice things and miss, more importantly, meeting very, very interesting people, folks who you never know how they will influence your life. I'm currently doing some part-time work at the Newcastle Courthouse Museum. That was a facility opened the same month and year that George Washington was born. And interestingly enough, William Penn, when he had the survey accomplished that created the top part of the state of Delaware, I found out that folks my wife and I have been friends with for over 40 years, that her she's a direct descendant of one of the two surveyors that William Penn had on that project. And the guy actually came over with William Penn on the same ship. So if I hadn't done that, that probably never would have come up in conversation. So things of that nature, don't be afraid to step out. But I'd also offer some advice, is to live up to your commitments, no matter how difficult it might be. Is if you give your word to do something, stay with it. I think it makes you a better person if you follow your commitment, because again, you've got to be honest with yourself and do what you think is correct. How would you like to be treated if the roles were reversed?